My 79-year-old mother was sitting alone in her kitchen at 2 in the afternoon when someone started pounding on her front door. Not knocking, pounding. She grabbed her walker, shuffled to the door, looked through the peephole for people, clipboards, cameras, and one woman standing in front, arms crossed, sunglasses on, smiling like she had already won. My mother opened the door. The woman said, and I need you to hear these exact words, "This property is in violation. You have 48 hours to comply, or we begin the fining process." My mother is 79. She has arthritis. She lives alone. She was still in her housecoat. And this woman, Carol Whitfield, HOA President of Maplewood Estates, turned around and walked away before my mother could even say a single word. I wasn't there that day. I was at work, 40 minutes away. But my mother called me. And when I heard her voice, shaking, confused, embarrassed, something shifted inside me. The HOA president had no idea who she had just declared war on. Let me take you back 6 months. My mother, Dorothy, moved into Maplewood Estates after my father passed. She needed a smaller house, a quiet neighborhood, a fresh start. She was sharp, independent, proud. She kept her garden beautiful. She waved at every neighbor. She baked cookies for the family next door. For the first 3 months, peace. She loved it there. Then the HOA president noticed her. It started small. A letter about her mailbox color. Then another about her welcome mat. Apparently, it was 2 inches too wide. Then one about her wind chimes. Wind chimes. My mother followed every rule. Fixed everything. Wrote polite responses. She thought it was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Because Carol Whitfield wasn't enforcing rules. She was sending a message. The HOA president did this to new residents, especially older ones, especially women living alone. She would pick a target, bury them in violations, and wait for them to either pay up or move out. She'd done it to 3 families before my mother. All 3 had left. The day of the raid, because that's exactly what I'm calling it. The HOA president had brought her full inspection team. 2 board members, a volunteer, and a man with a camera she claimed was documenting violations for HOA records. The violations they cited that day? 1. A potted plant on the porch was 6 inches outside the designated planting zone. 6 inches. 2. My mother's car had a small oil stain on her own private driveway. 3. Her screen door had a tiny tear in the mesh. The proposed fines? $150 per violation. Per day. Starting in 48 hours. $450 a day. On a 79-year-old retired widow living alone on a fixed income. I drove to my mother's house that same evening. She had the violation notices spread out on her kitchen table. She was reading them with a magnifying glass, trying to understand the legal language, trying to figure out what she had done wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. I sat with her for 2 hours, made her tea, read every letter, and then I made a decision. I was not going to let the HOA president do to my mother what she had done to 3 other families. I took photographs of everything. The plant, the driveway, the screen door. Then I walked the entire street and photographed every single home. What I found made my hands shake, but not from anger. From absolute certainty that Carol Whitfield had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because half the homes on that street had the exact same so-called violations. Some had worse. The HOA president's own home had an oil stain twice the size of my mother's. Her potted plants were overflowing onto the sidewalk. Her screen door had a visible crack running down the frame. Not a single violation notice had been sent to any of them. Only to Dorothy, the new widow, the elderly woman with a walker who answered the door in her housecoat. I went home that night and I started making calls. First to an attorney, then to a local tenant rights organization, then to a journalist I had met years ago who covered exactly these kinds of stories. And then, most importantly, I started talking to my mother's neighbors. The ones who had been there long enough to remember the families before her. The ones who had watched this happen 3 times already and said nothing because they were afraid. They weren't afraid anymore. By the time the HOA president woke up the next morning, she had no idea that a case was already being built against her. No idea that 7 of her neighbors had agreed to speak on record. No idea that a local news producer had already replied to my email. She thought she had won. She was about to find out she had only just started losing. The HOA president had raided my 79-year-old mother's home, cited her for a plant, an oil stain, and a torn screen door, threatened $450 a day in fines, and walked away like it was already over. She had done this before. 3 families, 3 forced departures. But this time she picked the wrong mother. The attorney I called that first night, her name was Patricia Mendez, and she specialized in HOA abuse cases. She listened to everything I told her. The violations, the fines, the pattern, the photographs. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This isn't just harassment. If what you're describing is accurate, this is selective enforcement. And in this state, that's actionable." I asked her what that meant practically. She said, "It means Carol Whitfield may have just handed you a lawsuit." We met in person 2 days later. I brought everything. The violation letters, my photographs of every home on the street, the names of 7 neighbors willing to speak, and the HOA's own governing documents, which I had downloaded from the county records office the night before. Patricia went through it all methodically. And what she found buried in those documents was something the HOA president had apparently forgotten or never expected anyone to read. The HOA's own bylaws required that all violations be reported uniformly. No selective targeting. No exemptions without formal board approval. Every citation had to be logged and cross-referenced. And the fining process required a written warning, a grace period, and a formal hearing before a single dollar could be collected. The HOA president had skipped every single step. The 48-hour ultimatum she had handed my mother in her housecoat on her own doorstep, completely illegal under the HOA's own rules. While Patricia built the legal case, I kept talking to neighbors. And the more people I spoke to, the darker the picture became. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Evelyn, told me she had watched the HOA president do this to a couple in their early 70s 2 years ago. They had fought back briefly, sent a letter to the board. Within a week, they had received 11 new violation notices. They sold their home 3 months later at a loss just to escape. Another neighbor, a man named Gerald who had lived on that street for 19 years, told me Carol Whitfield had been HOA president for 6 years. And in those 6 years, every single person who had challenged her had eventually left. He looked at me and said, "Nobody's ever come back with a lawyer before." The formal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center. The HOA president had sent my mother a notice: attend or forfeit your right to appeal. My mother attended. So did I. So did Patricia. So did a local news cameraman who was there, because the journalist I had contacted had filed a public records request for all HOA meeting minutes going back 4 years. And what he found was enough for a full segment. Carol Whitfield walked into that room, expecting a frightened old woman with a walker. She found a full room. Neighbors she had intimidated for years, sitting in rows, arms folded. A camera in the back. An attorney at the table next to my mother. The HOA president's face, I will never forget it. That smile she always wore just disappeared. Patricia spoke first. She presented the bylaw violations, the selective enforcement documentation, the photographic evidence, the neighbor testimonies, and then she placed one final document on the table: a formal complaint filed with the state's HOA regulatory board 3 days prior. Carol Whitfield tried to speak. She said the violations were legitimate. She said the process had been followed. She said my mother had been given every opportunity to comply. Patricia simply slid a copy of the HOA president's own driveway photographs across the table. The room went silent. The board voted that night, 3-1, to dismiss all violations against my mother. Every single one. Immediately and permanently. 2 weeks later, Carol Whitfield resigned as HOA president. The official reason given was personal commitments. Every person in that neighborhood knew the real reason. The state regulatory board completed their review 4 months later. The HOA president was formally barred from serving in any HOA leadership role in the state for 5 years. My mother still lives in Maplewood Estates. Her plant is on the porch exactly where she wants it. Her neighbors wave at her every morning. Evelyn brings her coffee on Sundays. And last spring, Dorothy planted roses along her front walkway. Big, full, beautiful roses, 3 inches outside the designated planting zone. Nobody has said a word.